Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Hello and welcome back to On the Middle East. My name is Amrin Zaman, and today I'll be discussing the horrors unfolding in Sudan's el-Fasher, where the rapid support forces are murdering civilians on a genocidal scale. This follows a 500-day-long siege of the area from which government forces withdrew, leaving tens of thousands of civilians trapped in el-Fasher to fend for themselves. With me here to discuss the latest situation and what it means for Sudan and regional stakeholders who are fueling the conflict is Kholood Khair, the founder of Confluence Advisory, a think and do tank founded in Khartoum. Good morning, Kholood. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Extremely horrific images coming out of el-Fasher. Kholood, could you kindly just lay out for us what the current status of the conflict in that very specific region is right now?
So the situation out to el-Fasher can be quite difficult to gauge because there's been a telecommunications blackout in across Sudan since February of 2024. And people are effectively only able to use Starlink whenever they get access to it. But what we do know, partially because the RSF themselves are recording it, is that there are huge violations and mass atrocities happening, genocidal style violence happening in el-Fasher as we speak. The joint forces, these are Darfuri armed groups that are fighting with the Sudanese armed forces against the RSF, are reporting that just in the first 48 hours or so of the RSF takeover of el-Fasher, that 2,000 people have died. Now, with that sort of level of violence and death, which we are seeing broadcast to us by the RSF themselves in real time, we anticipate that there'll be a huge loss of life just in the coming days and weeks. We know that, the people who are trying to leave el-Fasher are being killed. Those who are able to leave to the north and to the south of the city, the only two escape routes so far are either being extorted, killed, sexually assaulted, chased down and shot, or they're being rounded up within the city before they even leave. In any case, all of these people have been under siege for more than 550 days, and so they're terribly weak. They're dehydrated. They're not able to get away. If as in any way, and more importantly, I think what we're seeing here is the kind of violence that the RSF has been promising to mete out to the people of el-Fasher for the entirety of the siege. And we know very well that they're capable of this violence, not only because we saw it 20 years ago, and this conflict is very much a continuation of that, but because 2 years ago, when the RSF took over the capital of West Darfur State, Al-Jinaina, we saw the exact same kind of violence against African non-Arab groups, in that specific case, the Masalit. Those actions have subsequently been deemed a genocide by the United States, and we're very much seeing the hallmarks of genocidal violence in the conflict, in the atrocities happening today in el-Fasher.
500 days, and so this is no surprise, and we've seen all this violence play out before, far back as 20 years ago, as you said. And you said that the group itself, the RSF, has been telegraphing very openly that it will be committing such atrocities over and over again. So how is it possible that this has been permitted to happen? Is there any kind of serious diplomatic engagement that has been in play to prevent this?
So the RSF know very well that there is no accountability in Sudan. There hasn't been for decades. Every peace agreement that Sudan has had, certainly from the 2000s onwards, transitional justice has been a part of the negotiations, has been part of the talks, and has even featured in some of the peace agreements, but it has never been implemented. This is what they're counting on, effectively knowing the history of impunity in Sudan, which has very much led us to where we are in Sudan today, with abject violence and mass atrocities taking place, with the perpetrators this time around the RSF, but other armed groups as well. They know very well that they most likely will not face justice. The only justice that the people of Darfur have ever seen is in the case at the ICC a few weeks ago, where Ali Khoshaib, a member of President Bashir's security state and a member of the Janjaweed, the precursor of the RSF, was finally handed a sentence, was finally found guilty of 27 counts of war crimes at The Hague. There is no legal infrastructure for aid, there's no legal infrastructure for justice. There hasn't been ever. Round after round, we have seen senior military and security officials give out amnesties, actually, rather than pursue any kind of justice. So this is why we're seeing sort of rampant telegraphing of this violence by the RSF within the context of, where does this lead? Will we see any kind of peace agreement? Will we see any kind of ceasefire take place? There's been a quad formation of 4 countries, the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And that quad formation is problematic in and of itself. 3 out of those 4 countries don't want to see a democratic civilian Sudan, which is really the only way to end the cycle of war in Sudan. And 3 out of those 4 countries, i.e. all of them except for the United States, perhaps, don't want this war to end, in that they all benefit from this war to some degree, in particular the United Arab Emirates, which is gaining a lot of gold, both smuggled and taken out through official channels, and it's gaining a foothold in Sudan through its proxy actor, the RSF, but equally Egypt, which is able to get gold, gum arabic, cattle smuggled into through the Egyptian border, which is helping Egypt prop up its ailing economy. So in that context, it doesn't seem likely that this is the kind of formation, certainly under the current circumstances, that will bring about a peace deal. But in relation to the fighting that is happening right now across Sudan, and in particular the takeover of el-Fasher and sort of mass atrocities that we're seeing, the RSF have learned very well to game the system, the mediation system. Every time we see a large international gathering, whether it's this time in the Quad, or whether it was the April conference earlier this year in London, or whether it was the Jeddah 1 and 2 talks in 2023, the RSF has timed the worst of their atrocities to coincide with these talks. They're able to get a pat on the back and at the same time use these talks as political cover for the worst of their atrocities. And actually, this has been, unfortunately, very effective. The world is, in effect, quite complicit in this, because they allow the RSF to continue to use these talks as political cover without ever putting leverage on them to either cease.
But why? Why?
So, several reasons. The RSF has this is a very globalized war. It's taking place on 3 levels. Let's put it that way. There's the regional global element of it, which sees all of these different actors, particularly Arab states, deeply involved and invested in this conflict. There's the national level conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, but also myriad militias on either side. You have 17 militias fighting on the side of the Sudanese armed forces, around 7 or so on the side of the RSF. And you also have many different sort of civilian political factions that have either taken a side or have remained non-partisan. That is a political conflict that has been raging in Sudan for decades. Then you have the localized conflict, and much of the violence we're seeing in el-Fasher today is driven by these local considerations and these local motivations, in that we're seeing pastoralist groups which identify as Arab meting out, heinous atrocities against African groups which are sedentary farmer groups. And this is really a conflict for them at that local level over land, over resources, over who gets to represent and speak for the area. And all of these sort of levels of conflict effectively act as fractals for a larger conflict that I believe is taking place sort of more globally, which is that we're seeing the breakup of sovereign states. We're seeing, like we see in Libya, like we see in Yemen, like we see in Somalia and elsewhere. And we're seeing regional actors, in particular the United Arab Emirates, but also Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, really use use the fragility in these countries as a way to maximize their foreign policy objectives, most of which are underpinned by economic objectives. And because of the proximity and the closeness of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, UAE, to Western countries, particularly the United States, they're effectively able to get away with murder. And we have seen that, of course, also in the case of Israel and the way that it has leveraged its Western alliances to mete out violence against the Palestinians for decades. Similarly, Arab countries, and particularly the United Arab Emirates, which you'll remember signed a deal, the Abraham Accords, with the Israelis, effectively wanting to grant themselves that Israel-like Teflon status. And we're seeing the UAE really sort of come into its own as an imperial power in the region, trying to assert itself very muscularly, mostly economically, but increasingly militarily. And that has played out in Sudan, but also in other parts of the Horn of Africa in the most devastating ways.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision-makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25, for a discount.
Well, it's a really fascinating and horrifying situation. And you mentioned very articulately why the UAE and Egypt were benefiting from this conflict. But could you tell us a little bit more about why countries like Turkey, that do not share common borders with Sudan, are helping to fuel this conflict? Is it as simple a matter as wanting to be able to sell weapons, or does it see itself as having a vested stake in Sudan and that somehow its fracturing does serve its interests?
So there are two things here. One is trade and one is ideology. For all of these countries that I've mentioned, trade is a huge element of this, especially weapons trade. Now, the Swedish Institute for Peace Research has shown that the world is spending far more than it ever has on weapons, around $2.7 trillion. In comparison, the amount of money that the world is spending on peacekeeping is about 3 billion. So it really gives you a sense of global priorities as they are. Countries that are starting to flex their muscles, particularly rich petrostates in the Gulf. These middle powers have sort of caught on to this trend that they are huge buyers of particularly Western weaponry, which then they use in these conflicts. In particular, for example, the UAE has been shipping continuously over the summer weapons to the RSF through Libya, through Chad, etc. But we have countries like Turkey who make weapons. They make the Bayraktar drones that have been, very successful in many conflicts around the world, and which now give the Sudanese armed forces, sort of a level playing field, if you will, with the RSF, who have been mostly given Chinese drones by the United Arab Emirates. For the Turks, they have wanted a foothold on the Red Sea, particularly the Sawakin base, which under the Ottoman Empire was really a sort of a foothold that the Ottomans had when they were ruling Sudan in the 1800s. They see this as sort of their birthright. Sawakin belongs to them, and they had struck a deal with Omar al-Bashir, the ousted dictator, before he was removed through the revolution. But the ideology here is really important. The Turks and the Qataris really back a Muslim Brotherhood government in Sudan, and Sudan is the only country in Africa and the Middle East that has had a successful, and by that I mean a long reign of Muslim Brotherhood rule. Egypt, for example, had a short-lived rule under President Morsi, but with the exception of Sudan, very few countries have had that long-term Muslim Brotherhood rules. Turkey and Qatar back that kind of rule in the region. And because it has been a relatively success in that it has had a long tenure, the Turks are hoping to sort of support the return of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan, which is which is a main belligerent, if you will, in this conflict, in that they want to see this war as a way to bring themselves back to power. Right now, they have allied with the Sudanese armed forces, which is why we see traditional allies of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Qataris, the Turks, the Iranians, back the Sudanese armed forces in this conflict.
It's pretty confusing, isn't it? Because on the other hand, Egypt, the current government in Egypt, hates the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood President Morsi. So it's really difficult to get one's head around these sort of different alliances. But ultimately, it's ordinary people who suffer as a result. And how do you convince the world to act in their favor? And when does, humanity, if you will, to put it very simply, trump all of these geopolitical considerations?
Well, we're in a world right now, unfortunately, where humanity doesn't trump those geopolitical considerations. The US designated the violence that the RSF committed in El Geneina as a genocide ordinarily, and 20 years ago that set off a series of international actions that meant that we saw UN Security Council resolutions, we saw United Nations African Union peacekeeping force, we saw the ICC get into gear and really start to investigate the violence that was taking place, eventually ending up with 5 indictments, including President Bashir, the only sitting president to ever be indicted by the ICC on crimes against humanity, war crimes, and then eventually genocide. So that world is gone, and it's very clear that that world is gone. And in many ways, the violence in Gaza has shown us that it actually takes quite a lot, that the world is very okay. And by here, I mean world leaders, not publics. World leaders are okay with a lot of violence being meted out against civilians. And what we have in Sudan here is a war against civilians. It is primarily civilians that are dying. It is not SAF soldiers. It is not RSF troops. It is not members of the various militias that are allied to them. It is Sudanese civilians. And that is because if you understand this war as I do, as a counter-revolutionary conflict, in other words, it is a conflict by the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces against the revolution of 2019 that unseated Omar al-Bashir, but also was a very popular mass push against militarism itself, then you understand why it is that we're seeing so many people die, why it is we're seeing the Sudanese armed forces not declaring famine, which would also trigger an international response and increase funding, why we're seeing the RSF using hunger and famine and starvation as a weapon of war, why we're seeing mass sexual gender-based violence, and we're seeing conflict-related sexual violence be rampant. Sudan is the world's largest humanitarian crisis, the world's largest displacement crisis, the world's largest hunger crisis, and the world's largest protection crisis all at once. And yet we're not seeing anyone really lift a finger in any of those, to sort of combat any of those crises. And when it comes to, countries in the region, particularly, let's say, Egypt, etc., their interest in Sudan is that they want a weak Sudan that is ruled by a military, in particular the Sudanese armed forces. They see Sudan as an extension of their southern border. And so in relation to the Muslim Brotherhood question, they're willing to tolerate, to a certain degree, the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood through a weak military. The Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan has been active since the 1940s and eventually became a party not long after that, and has really been infiltrating the Sudanese armed forces since the late 1970s and really sort of entrenched that during the 30 years of Bashir rule from 1989 till 2019. And so for the Egyptians, they're willing to tolerate some level of Muslim Brotherhood rule in Sudan, so long as it does not intervene with the Muslim Brotherhood's aspirations in Egypt, and so long as it keeps the Sudanese armed forces in power. It's the same with the Saudis who have been trying to frame themselves as neutral arbiters, hosting ceasefire talks at the beginning of the war in 2023. They are very much for the Sudanese armed forces for 2 reasons. One, they want to see some kind of stability on the Red Sea, and the stability they favor is through the Sudanese armed forces. So there again, they're willing to tolerate some level of Islamist rule. And they also don't want the Emiratis, with whom they're in very, acute regional competition, to gain a foothold on the Red Sea through the rapid support forces. So all of these proxy elements can sometimes seem confusing, but there really is a very clear logic that is playing out here. One way to understand understand it is geographically. You have the Egyptians and the Ethiopians backed by the Emiratis, fighting over the Nile water, and you have the Saudis and the Emiratis fighting over the Red Sea. So this is very much a fight, a war over water as well when it comes to the regional picture. And all of these moving pieces mean that what we're seeing is that however we're planning to resolve this conflict, it will not just be resolved by the Sudanese. It will not just be resolved by, sort of the United States, the United Nations, the African Union, the League of Arab States, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, all of these, this alphabet soup of multilateral organizations. It will, to some degree, need to see a deconfliction of the foreign policies of our Arab neighbors.
Well, I mean, looking at what just happened in el-Fasher, and we've all heard how strategic el-Fasher is and how being able to take it would allow the rapid support forces then to move back onto Khartoum, which it lost. Will it be able to take back Khartoum? And in that case, what does that mean going forward for this conflict? Does it mean separation or victory for the RSF, or just back and forth, back and forth?
So Sudan has had a very long history of armed conflict. The Sudanese armed forces has been fighting its own people effectively for almost the 70 years of Sudan's independence history. It has, propped up a military state that has only ever encouraged competing, politically competing at the state level through armed conflict. When you have a military state, you can't really go to the ballot box to compete for power. You pick up a gun and that becomes your price of admission into the politics of Sudan. And that has been a formula that has been in place since 1955, even before Sudan became independent. And so when it comes to, what this looks like in Sudan going forward, with the RSF taking over el-Fasher, well, it means several things. One, a continuation of the conflict in all likelihood, because we have seen the RSF receive massive shipments, primarily from the United Arab Emirates, through a port in northern Somalia, Bosaso, an airbase in northern Somalia, as well as through the eastern government in Libya. And the volume of those weapons suggests that the RSF can really mount a serious military campaign. For them, el-Fasher is important strategically, but also symbolically, because historically el-Fasher was the capital of the entire Darfur region, which is today 5 states. And so with the sort of taking of el-Fasher, what they've also managed to do is secure Sudan's western border with Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, and parts of the border with South Sudan. They have already, since a few months ago, taken over a triangle border region between Sudan, Libya, and Egypt. So with that western border secure, and now with el-Fasher in their hands, they're able to utilize the weapons they have procured over the past few months to push eastwards, deploy some of their troops also to the campaign in Kordofan, which is happening simultaneously. We've also seen the RSF commit atrocities in a town called Bara. That is a town half sort of partway between in the Kordofans on the way to Khartoum. And if they are able to continue their march onwards, they would be able to at least mount a serious offensive on the capital. But taking el-Fasher also allows them to take another town in the north of North Darfur called Adebba. A town in northern state called Adebba. And taking over that town allows them to go even further, closer to the Egyptian border, and from then onward to the eastern Sudan and the Red Sea, which is ultimately their military objective. And so taking el-Fasher is very strategic for the RSF. It also allows them to make political claims to be the government of the West, to be the government of the peripheries, a claim they have started since they founded their government in Niala a few weeks ago. Now, this is basically just an administration. It is not an entity capable of governing. The RSF has not shown themselves ever to be an entity capable of governing. But this is for the RSF, something of a turning point. Now, just to put this all in context, October is the beginning of the dry season. And so the RSF has mounted these offensives in el-Fasher and in North Kordofan state in order to start off this dry season as they mean to go on. In other words, to really gain an advantage very early on and try to go as eastwards, as far eastwards as possible before the rainy season starts again in June next year.
So much to unpack here and so much misery. Thank you so much, Kholood, for laying this out so articulately and so passionately in your I mean, I'm sure it's very hard for you to cope with this emotionally, being from Sudan. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks for covering Sudan.
And this brings us to the end of this week's episode of On the Middle East. For more on Sudan and the rest of the region, you can go to our website www.al-monitor.com. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.